I'm an intern at the Sustainable Economies Law Center right now, and that's where Chris works as the Director of Land and Housing Justice. Um, uh, the Sustainable Economies Law Center is a democratically run nonprofit that supports communities to create and control their own sustainable sources of land, labor, and capital. And at the Law Center, Chris co-leads or contributes to the Law Center's housing, worker self-directed nonprofit, farmland, and money and finance programs. So Chris, this is you heard a little bit about the background of this group. Part of the work is just to try to feel out all the edges of the meaning of solidarity economy, and in particular, wanting to learn more about your work and where the law and policy fits into supporting and making possible these things that we're talking about. So sort of the floor is yours to kind of talk about stuff that you're working on, stuff that you're excited about, and ways that this group could better understand the stuff that you do.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia, for the invitation and the introduction. And it's good to be connected with y'all as someone from the area, born in Washington, D.C., grew up in Maryland and went to school in Virginia, joining you now from the ancestral lands of the Edisto Cuso Natchez peoples in Charleston, South Carolina, and have lived many places between here and there, including Oakland, California, where the Sustainable Economies Law Center was founded and where most of our staff and work is rooted. Although I'm now on the East Coast and we've got staff kind of branching out across the country. So yeah, this work is happening all over. Can y'all see the slides? Cool. And remind me, how much time do we have? Into the hour?
What do you say, Matthew, Lindsay?
Cool. I don't have a hard stop or anything though. Just I couldn't remember if it was till 6 or 6:30.
Around 6, but I know I'm flexible. I don't have a hard stop. So if the conversation's flowing and we have time, we shouldn't cut it off. I don't think, just to meet the time. But usually we're wrapping up around 6:15.
Great. Cool. So yeah, I have some thoughts just organized via slide, and we'll definitely try to go through that with enough time for conversation. But I would invite y'all to jump in with questions, comments as we go, just to make this more of a conversation. But yeah, just to give a little bit more sense of like what's bringing me to this work as well. As I mentioned, I grew up in Maryland, in a pretty segregated neighborhood, like most neighborhoods are in the US. But I went to a really diverse public school. And as I got older, I wanted to understand what this dissonance was between like the neighborhood I went home to every day that was 99.9% white, and the school that I could walk down the street to, that was 50% people of color, immigrants, folks from around the world. So, I found my way into various types of work, working with houseless folks, working with young people in the South Bronx. I was a teacher for a while, but it was all coming still from a sort of a charitable mindset, this idea that like poor people exist and they need help. And I understand I have some privilege, but no real analysis, of kind of the structural causes of that. And so for me, it actually took a spiritual process to shift from that charitable orientation to one of deep solidarity. And for me, this was over a decade ago now. I ended up walking a 900-mile Buddhist pilgrimage route around this island in Japan, and then spent almost a year traveling around the world, mostly on the gift economy, without very much money, but just relying on the generosity of people I met. And it was a very profound experience. And so in this case, it was sort of living into a feeling of solidarity with all of life in a sense. And that made pretty clear that capitalism was incompatible with organized life on Earth, let alone the dignity and the sacredness of life that I was experiencing, through this spiritual awakening. But it was also around that time that the Occupy movement kicked off. And so from that spiritual experience, it was really the Occupy movement that helped ground me politically in what that meant. So it's sort of a movement from the head of understanding like something about society is not quite right to the heart of like feeling that something that other ways are possible, and into the hands of actually organizing and getting politically engaged. So I was actually living in the UK studying at that point, and got involved in Occupy London, which was one of the largest and longest established camps in the Occupy movement. And it really showed me the liberatory possibilities of self-organizing and creating radically welcoming spaces. I mean, the camp there was meeting the needs of some of the most traumatized and marginalized people in London. And that was beautiful, but it was also really messy. So it was both an experience of the possibilities, radical possibilities, and limitations of these types of experiments. What happens in the tyranny of structurelessness, for example, you know, we're radically engaging people in this democratic process, but without a whole lot of shared cultural understanding, a lot of boundaries around how to work with one another. So at its best, you know, that camp for me really created the conditions for people there to tap into what they already knew intuitively about what they wanted. And it deeply valued participation. Everyone's voice mattered the same, whether they were, you know, a chronically houseless person or a PhD, you know, who would come down to the camp and talk about their work. And that felt pretty revolutionary. So after that experience, I moved back to the US, to California, and that's where I first came across the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and not just their work supporting all of these projects, which I now sort of understand through the framework of solidarity economy, but worker cooperatives, local currencies, community land trusts, housing cooperatives, small scale mutual aid projects. They were supporting that, but from the legal and policy side of things, which at that point in my life wasn't something I was particularly interested in, or something that I was bringing a whole lot of experience to. I didn't go to law school. I don't have any prior legal work. But through that, I learned that in California and a few other states, including Virginia, you can become a lawyer without going to law school. And so as someone with, education privilege, among many others, looking for a way to get involved in social movement work and the solidarity economy, and sort of creating the world that I want to exist for everyone in these small scale experiments, deciding to become a lawyer to support just that kind of work felt like a way that I could fit in, sort of get in where you fit in idea. And so that was in like 2013. And, since then I've been working at the Law Center for almost 8 years, maybe over 8 years now. I passed the California bar in 2018. And so I've been practicing law, sort of a barefoot lawyer. And yeah, and now I live in South Carolina. I'm back on the East Coast. Unfortunately, I can't practice law here because of the way that the legal profession has created all these state-by-state monopolies, et cetera. It's a very exclusionary profession, but that's part of the work, is to transform the way that knowledge is shared in society, as well as the material conditions that people live within. And I think that training actually shapes really how we approach legal work at the Law Center. For us, it's actually important to state up front when we're working with folks that it's human relationships, not legal relationships, that matter. And so a lot of our work is actually about decentering the expertise of lawyers and supporting people to access what they already know intuitively, or what they can learn together through group process, kind of like what y'all are engaged in, which is cool to see. So instead of folks coming to us as experts, and paying us $300 to $600 an hour, which is like market rate attorney fees in the Bay Area, we create deep reciprocal relationships with our clients that are rooted in solidarity and mutual care. We learn a lot from working with folks, and we approach it in a spirit of collaboration. It's often about teaching people what they can actually do themselves rather than relying on experts to do for them. So we're transforming, how law is practiced, but of course, the law itself is what we're trying to change. Our work kind of sits at the intersection of economic, legal, and cultural transformation. Because if we understand that the economy is sort of, the dominant economy, of course, is rooted in extraction and exclusion and oppression, it's really maintained by a legal system that, sorry, I got a little guy in the back who's excited to join the conversation. Yeah, so the legal system is what really enforces and maintains capitalism, right? It's designed for the same purposes as an extractive and oppressive economy. And it's because it's written by, the people whose interests are best served by capitalism. So therefore, its cultural work is also really important, and deconstructing and rebuilding a society that actually works for everyone. So even as a legal organization, we kind of see our role as culture work sometimes, of spreading a narrative of what else is possible. And because we're in sort of the privileged position of getting to work with hundreds, actually thousands of really incredible grassroots projects, some that are incredibly transformative, we get a sense of like what is possible in a way that not so many people do. And so we feel the obligation to try to share that and articulate it in colorful and accessible ways. You can see our use of cartoons. So I should attribute as well that all the cartoons come from my coworker, Janelle, who's also the co-founder of the Law Center and our cartoonist in chief, among other things. So I would say over time, our work has kind of settled into a few different buckets. One is work to democratize labor, in the workplace. And recently, some of the most exciting work that we're doing is in supporting immigrant-led cooperatives in the Bay. There's strong traditions of cooperativism in many other cultures, particularly Latin American cultures. And those people are often some of the most marginalized and exploited workers in our economy. And so turning to cooperative development is a really great way of both meeting people's material needs in ways that aren't being met, but also involving them in sort of a broader movement for community self-determination. And there's some interesting ways in which being a worker owner of a business enables undocumented folks access to the economy that being an employee doesn't. And we might be teaching some workshops on that, although there's sort of a gray area around how much we talk about those types of things, not wanting to put folks at risk. But all to say that cooperative development and the most exploited communities, including immigrant communities, is where some of the most powerful work is happening. Also, in this moment of economic turmoil, we're seeing the possibility for more worker-led conversions of existing businesses. And that's another area of work that we're trying to build up our capacity in. Prior to the pandemic, there is already a sort of small business succession crisis, where some very high number that I can't remember off the top of my head of small businesses in the country are owned by boomers who are retiring. And so the question is, who will own those businesses and who will control those jobs for millions and millions of workers? Will these businesses just cease to exist when owners retire? Will they be captured by larger companies, and further the concentration and consolidation of wealth and power? Or could they be opportunities for the workers themselves who are rooted in that community, who are invested in jobs and services and goods being produced there, actually become owners. And so we're doing some exciting work around that, worker-led conversions in particular, of getting organized workers to buy out businesses from their bosses or retiring owners. And then the other big area of democratizing labor is actually in the nonprofit sector, because a lot of social movement work, a lot of solidarity economy movement work ends up being organized as nonprofits for various reasons. Our legal system privileges nonprofits in ways it doesn't for cooperatives, and sometimes forces us into awkward and false, distinctions between mutual aid, public benefit, mutual benefit, which we could talk more about later. But there's a growing number of organizations that we're working with to democratize the nonprofit space. As some of y'all know, I don't know where y'all are coming from, but nonprofits end up often really replicating corporate hierarchies and ways of treating workers, even when their visions for society are about equity and justice. And so it's a really natural place to be organizing with people who already have the values of deep democracy, but just need the support and figuring out how to get it done. So that's something I'm working on quite a bit. We're also doing a lot of work around democratizing land, whether that's through community control of housing, working with tenants and community groups to buy out buildings when owners are selling them, for example, or increasingly through what a lot of folks call land rematriation, sort of returning land to Black and Indigenous communities in particular, for agroecological food production, for land and forest stewardship, for sacred site preservation and cultural renewal. Some of the most exciting, inspiring work that I'm doing right now is with a few groups who are collectively in the process of acquiring something like 4,000 acres of land in California, sort of transfers from white owners to Black and Indigenous groups who are organizing themselves collectively, who are really rooted in culture and spiritual work and healing. And that's been extremely powerful to be a part of. One of our biggest clients who we've worked with for now probably 5 or 6 years is a real estate cooperative. It's called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And it functions kind of like a community land trust, if you're familiar with that. The goal is to take land out of the speculative market into permanent community control. But they're organized as a multi-stakeholder cooperative rather than a nonprofit like most community land trusts are. And they're rooted in the East Bay of Oakland. And so are looking at multiple interventions into the housing crisis in the Bay Area. Some of it is working with tenants who are about to be displaced because their owner has put a building up for sale, and sort of intervening and helping to raise capital to buy the building out. And some of it's actually doing community-led development in historically Black parts of Oakland, where all of a sudden there's a huge influx of capital and redevelopment interests, but then gathering community visions and community capital to say, no, we want to develop or redevelop what are historically Black neighborhoods to celebrate and preserve and continue the legacy of Black culture and Black futures. So they're doing some really exciting work, and it overlaps with a third bucket, which is around democratizing capital. So EB-PREC, as we call it, one of their unique models is the ability to raise capital directly from community members, from everyday people, through $1,000 investments, which can be structured, to be paid in over time to make it accessible to folks. And they've raised several $100,000 in shares from community, which is quite a lot. Even it's not enough to buy a house even in Oakland, unfortunately. But what it does is it helps them leverage that community support to access institutional investors, philanthropic, gift capital, and other sources of capital to build a capital stack to really actually intervene in pretty large scale projects. So there, one of the things we focus on is supporting everyday people to be able to put whatever money they have, even if it's a modest amount, directly back into the local solidarity economy. So it's supporting solidarity economies that need often small amounts of capital, and it's providing a place for folks, sort of working people, but who have a little bit of savings, some place to put their money that's not furthering the most extractive and harmful industries on the planet. If you have any money in a pension fund or a 401k or even like a money market account, chances are, that's funding oil extraction, weapons manufacturing, global land grabbing, surveillance, capitalism, all the things that most of us here are probably working to tear down. But we don't have other places to put that. And so we're trying to build places like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative where folks can actually invest in their neighbors' housing security and get super modest returns on that investment on a long time horizon. There's a lot of other interesting work happening to democratize capital, which we could come back to. I'll just name one, which is not a project of ours, but someone who we work with closely. It's called the Seed Commons, which is a cooperative of local revolving loan funds. And so they're building the infrastructure to democratically govern capital at scale and to deploy it locally around the country for worker cooperative development and increasingly for real estate, community control of land and housing stuff. They're able to build that national infrastructure that's then democratically governed from the bottom up so we can access capital markets, that individual projects can't, and then exercise and build our governing power, which we need to be able to do, to actually contest for power at larger scales. So there's some really exciting work happening in Seed Commons in particular and other similar projects around the country. And the last kind of broad bucket is democratizing law and policy. And so some of the work we're doing there includes a recently launched project called the Radical Real Estate Law School, where we're training up another cohort of people to become lawyers without going to law school like I did, but who are all like grassroots land defenders and housing justice organizers who are going to be specifically building the skills to support community control of land remediation projects in California. So that's super exciting. And of course, we're doing some policy work, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute in sort of the next section. But all is to say, there's, the solidarity economy kind of is everywhere, and there's some really powerful work happening. I think some of the things we can talk more about, I would love to get y'all's thoughts on, of course, is just how are we actually aggregating the power of these local projects and networking them together. So I guess some kind of takeaways from the clients and campaigns that I'm most excited about right now. I think the most powerful work is both visionary and oppositional work right now that is articulating and practicing a different way of meeting people's needs, but is also connected to demands, to stop the harms that are happening in our communities. So examples being like tenant organizing that is both resisting evictions happening, but then also organizing those tenants into housing cooperatives or community land trusts. So we're taking the resistance work and connecting it to solidarity economy projects that are building community control. Projects like some of the land rematriation work I mentioned that are deeply rooted in culture and are kind of approaching organizing from a joyful or a soulful place, I think is also something I'm seeing a lot. And it speaks to me because it's work that's almost inherently sustainable because it's nourishing people's sense of identity and belonging. And I think that's actually pretty important for long-term organizing. Moving at the speed of community, which is just sort of suggesting that conflicts are always going to happen, particularly in I think in democratic spaces, because we're welcoming all voices. But it's super important that we figure out how to address conflicts in effective and generative and transformative ways. And a lot of projects we've seen have unfortunately collapsed because people couldn't figure out how to navigate conflict. And so investing up front and building those skills of anti-oppression, of transformative justice, I think is crucial for our movement going forward. And then this idea of taking the flourishing of mutual aid projects that we've seen in the last year in particular, and I'm part of a bunch in the Charleston region who've been meeting, for the last year, trying to resist evictions, trying to raise money and redistribute it to undocumented folks and incarcerated people, for example. But how do we turn those rapid response projects into permanently organized community institutions that are meeting needs in an ongoing way and building new leaders in the community? So those are some high-level lessons. I'll just pause for a second. So there was something in the chat. Welcome, Joe. The next section is going to talk a little bit more about law and policy stuff. Does anyone have questions or comments before I move into that?
I have kind of been scooting around your website here, just looking at some of the things that you've been talking about, and I just already see so many connections coming up. So I'm really excited to follow up with you. But when you were talking about rematriation of land, it sounded like a familiar project, and I had just learned about this, something similar from the Climate Justice Alliance, and it looks like Sustainable Economies Law Center is part of Climate Justice Alliance as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really exciting. The organization that I work for is the Alliance for Appalachia, and so we're a regional coalition, but we're also a member of CJA, so I'm excited to see that connection. And then what you were saying about worker self-directed nonprofits, that's resonating too, because we, like I said, I'm work with a coalition of groups, so I see groups at different points in their kind of organizational development. And one of our members right now is trying to move from fiscal sponsorship to their own nonprofit status. And so kind of based on what you were saying, it sounds like there may be some tools that you all have that could help them. They're based in Virginia, so I'm wondering if the tools that you all have are primarily for California nonprofits, or do they translate pretty well across states?
Yeah, a lot of the basic democratic practices can translate to any group of people. Some of the more specific kind of legal tools that we've put together are focused on California, but can be good starting places for groups elsewhere. We do have a whole program on worker self-directed nonprofits. So there's a bunch of resources on our website on, like decision-making processes, like how to structure a board of directors if you're forming your own nonprofit. We recently released a toolkit for how to draft bylaws for a democratically run nonprofit. And that's an example of something that's written for California law, but is designed, we basically structured a series of conversations that groups can have that will lead to then bylaws, which you could also use as the basis to research your own state nonprofit laws, for example.
That's great. I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep moving into the next section, and again, feel free to jump in with questions or thoughts. There was a request to kind of talk a little bit more about sort of the legal landscape and policy landscape. Sort of some high-level thoughts on the legal system itself. You know, the ruling class economics is about the production and management of scarcity, in a sense. I mean, that's actually the definition of economics, according to economics professionals. Now, I think a lot of us are invested in a world of abundance, creating a world of abundance, of connection, of belonging. But the legal system that we exist within kind of perpetuates the idea that we're all things that are isolated and separate and self-interested, and that we can appeal to the sort of coercive power of the state to defend our things. So law is sort of the enforcement and regulation of the scarcity of economics. And lawyers are often in the position of greasing the wheels of capitalism. That is the job of corporate lawyers, you know, is to defend the interests of some of the most, you know, extractive, destructive corporations in the world. And, you know, again, it's like the legal system itself in regulating pollution, labor exploitation, mass incarceration, it is actually allowing and justifying those very things to happen, right? We don't say you cannot drill for oil. We say you can drill for oil in this place and pollute up to this much. You can extract this much value from your workers and you know, control their lives up to this point, sort of as far as they can take it without the people demanding something different. And it's all written in a very confusing, exclusionary way that makes it very hard, particularly for small, grassroots, low resource projects to navigate the compliance. And that's one of the huge barriers to solidarity economy projects ultimately. And unfortunately, it is often navigating employment laws or landlord-tenant laws or securities laws. Some of the things that actually, of course, we need worker protections, we need tenant protections. But in the broader context of a legal system that is designed to support extraction, those things still unfortunately create some barriers to the work we want to do at the local level. We just were talking about the Climate Justice Alliance. You know, they have this beautiful framework for just transition. You know, how do we move from the extractive economy to a regenerative one? And of course, changing the rules is one piece of that puzzle. So we kind of see ourselves fitting into this framework at both the level of helping change the rules. It's a whole center part of the diagram, and resourcing, you know, the work that is rooted in cooperation for the purpose of ecological well-being, and is producing resources in regenerative ways, governed in deeply democratic fashion, all coming from a place of caring and sacredness. I mean, they've just beautifully captured some very complex issues, I think, in a pretty small diagram. Sorry, my screen's got messed up. So yes, in trying to build the space for solidarity economy work to happen within the economy, you know, we're moving towards sort of what we want to see is sort of a commons-based society in which the people who are impacted by decisions are the ones who are setting the rules and governing the use of resources, for example. In the meanwhile, we have an extractive marketplace and a very strong sort of philanthropic charitable sector, which the law, you know, reinforces through the recognizing nonprofits and giving them tax benefits. And so we're constantly navigating these sort of awkward juxtapositions in the fact that the law doesn't really create space. It's the solidarity economy in large part is not legible to the legal system. I mentioned this before, that this sort of false binary between cooperatives and nonprofits in the legal system. Nonprofits are of course, oriented towards public benefit, whereas cooperatives are understood as mutual benefit. But we understand, movement-based cooperatives as meeting both of those needs. We meet people direct needs in collective ways because it furthers the common good. And the law doesn't recognize that, it forces us into this distinction. So a lot of solidarity economy projects will end up using one of these forms, but it doesn't always work particularly well. And so we, instead of centering questions of what legal structure to use for this worker cooperative or this land project, that's the question that people often come to us for. But we're trying to work on a sort of loose set of design principles for folks to think through in designing organizations and projects that will then help lead to some of those downstream questions about what legal structure. So thinking about how does this project spread wealth through the community? And here's sort of a bunch of technical ways that we've seen this done. But starting with that question and working through it as a group. How does an organization spread power? How does it avoid the concentration of power, usually along the same axes of oppression that the dominant system is built upon? And how does it spread power to involve more people and therefore create more resilient and visionary projects? And then lastly, how does this organization root that power and wealth in the community over the long term? So we're talking about how do we prevent this cool housing cooperative from down the line deciding to demutualize and sell on the open market because all the members actually get a lot of money? How do we prevent worker-owned businesses like New Belgium Brewery, which is employee-owned, but then selling out to a larger multinational company? All those current workers get a nice payout, but what about all the previous workers? What about the future workers? In demutualizing, you've lost this community-rooted project. So those are some design questions for thinking through, how to ultimately structure your project legally. But of course, this still all intersects with a legal system that we are actively trying to change. In some cases, making small tweaks to sort of technical aspects of the law. And in other cases, and this is something I think is timely now to discuss, is like, how are we connecting solidarity economy demands to much broader transformative policy visions like a Green New Deal or Medicare for All? So some of the things we've worked on over the past few years include like creating a revolving loan fund for worker cooperatives in the city of Berkeley, which actually built on many years of organizing. It started with a local resolution, just saying like, yay, cooperatives, to several steps beyond that of actually allocating public resources to worker cooperatives and giving them preferential procurement. We also passed the California Worker Cooperative Act, which is sort of in that spirit of helping to make legible solidarity economy projects by defining what a worker cooperative is under state law, which creates a very clear thing for organizations to use in forming. In this case, we're able to write in a securities law exemption, which was what the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative ended up using to sell shares to the community and raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy back housing. We've also worked on things like the California Seed Democracy Act, which protected the right of groups to save and share seeds on a non-commercial basis. And we're working on a bunch of other stuff now. including like tenant opportunity to purchase legislation in cities of Oakland and Berkeley, which creates a statutory right for tenants to be able to make an offer on the building that they live in if it's ever going to be sold. So how are we creating more rights for people to expand democracy further into the workplace or the home or the ballot box or the school? Yeah, so kind of some of the learning edges for us around law and policy work is, how to not get wrapped up and overwhelmed by the gratuitous details of the law, and remember that it is human relationships that really matter. We can figure out the legal stuff. Supporting folks to really understand and believe that legal choices are in their hands, and that yes, technical support is often really important, but there's a lot of stuff that folks can actually figure out on their own. And on the policy side, that we often have to break the rules to make the rules. So our most successful policy work was when folks were just doing things and they ended up being shut down because they violated a law. And that then created a catalyst for a campaign to change the law. So examples being that Seed Democracy Act, where folks were just, as they've been doing for millennia, saving seeds that they grew in their backyard or their community gardens, and then having seed swaps. Somehow this violated health and safety laws, and this started happening in states all across the country. So we ended up gathering with groups and launched this nationwide campaign to save seed sharing and help pass laws in a handful of states to carve out space for kind of mutual aid-based seed sharing. Some questions, that I think I'm sitting with, I think we all can be, is how much to invest our capacity in tweaking the existing system, even when it's creating more space in the short term for solidarity economy projects, versus how much do we commit to building with other social movements and doing the work of building those relationships and education so that we can integrate solidarity economy demands into these more transformative visions. I think that's probably another good place for me to pause. There's sort of another section, but I think it's less relevant. I see the time, so would love to kind of open it up at this point for more conversation.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Like, I'm going to come back. I'm glad this is going to be recorded because I'm going to watch it again. I just found that. So one thing that I want to say is, like, for people who are having questions about what exactly is a solidarity economy, I think everything that you went through would be very helpful just for people to understand what is this all about. So it's just for that, it's so valuable. And I have tons of questions, but I don't want to hog all the time. But one question I have is, have you ever heard of the fair shares model for creating multi-stakeholder cooperatives? Have you ever heard of that?
I think I've heard of it, but I'm not super familiar with it. Yeah.
Right. So in Virginia, you can't create a cooperative. There's no legal framework for creating like a worker cooperative. So that is a problem in lots of places. And so this is one solution to that. And it was created by a professor in the United Kingdom, plus a few other people. He didn't do it by himself. And it's a set of, like, it's a framework. He has a generator, kind of a rules generator where you can plug in everything that you want for your multi-stakeholder cooperative. And then it sends you back like a document that can be used and kind of adjusted for your state or your country to make a cooperative entity, either as an LLC, like a limited liability company, or as a actual corporation, or as a nonprofit. So so we use that, and I think I took his course, and I think we're the only like any entity that's used his rules in the United States. And he's just getting started with companies that are actually using it. But I thought I would just tell you about that because, you were talking about how the legal structure, kind of the solidarity economy doesn't really fit into the legal structure the way that it is. And so you kind of have to sometimes go do creative things, think outside the box. And this to me is one solution that kind of gets around until there's a law in Virginia that allows for a cooperative. You can do it this way. What you do is you just make a liability company and you use it as we're using the fair shares operating agreement as the operating agreement here. We had a lawyer look at it and it makes it a cooperative. And because fair shares is recognized, we can, once we get the operating agreement signed basically, then we can go to the international cooperative, the people who give you the right to use the co-op name, and you can use the co-op name, like you're considered a cooperative. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. I'll look into it a little bit. I just also dropped a link to a resource that we host, cooplaw.org, which also has some example operating agreements and tries to break down sort of all the legal complexities that show up in the cooperative space. Like, how do you use an LLC, a limited liability company, to form a cooperative? I will just say though that templates, we create a lot of them and they can be very useful. I think it's also important to recognize that context is always important, right? And so we recommend that folks use templates, as a way to have conversations for yourselves rather than copying and pasting examples from other groups, because they may not meet your needs. And actually the process of developing things it can be pretty important.
Chris, I want to ask a question. I love this concept, the note you mentioned about the legibility of solidarity economies in terms of the law. One thing in Virginia, we've got a pretty active legal aid system. It's a bunch of different groups in Virginia that are doing you go into their websites and you see they say we do economic justice work. And in my collaborations with them, I find a lot of that work is just really reactive. They're either fighting for people that have been abused or discriminated against, and they're never really thinking beyond that, right? It's like they're in this kind of cycle. So that's what's inspiring, I think, about what you all are doing, is you're thinking past all that stuff. So I was just thinking about are there ways that we can engage lawyers, especially in the legal aid side of things? Because if Virginia is gonna have a solidarity economy in the future at some point, right? We've got to start to build that legal system, and then we're going to need partners and friends to help do that. So,
yeah, totally. Similar challenge here in South Carolina where I'm based, and we don't even have that strong of a legal aid community. It's there, but legal aid attorneys are often so overworked, overstretched, over capacity that even trying to educate them, work with them, it can be hard just because they're holding so much just sort of harm reduction work. One of the things, there's a link to it in the slides as well at the very end, is we have a legal fellowship that's sort of a community of practice for attorneys around the country and actually internationally as well, who are interested in getting trained up in supporting solidarity economy work and connecting into a network of other people. So that's something, to share. We take applications to that on a rolling basis. That could be one way of supporting people who are already in your community to maybe get more trained up in it. And I don't know of what this looks like or how it's happening in Virginia, but the fact that there is this pathway to becoming a lawyer without law school, we're trying to really utilize that in California, to train up movement people, basically, instead of trying to like convince lawyers, why to do this, to like take people who are already committed to this work and build the legal skills. That's a long-term commitment, but I think we have to be thinking of this work, in terms of generations, right? And so that's another thing that could be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Oh, you can go ahead, please.
Chris, a lot of the resources that you're mentioning are California-based, local resolutions in California cities, state laws in California. What is sort of like, if you were to sort of like draw like a little map of organizations in California that you work with, like what kind of types of organizations do you and does SELC network with to help that kind of stuff happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, the Bay Area in particular is somewhat unique in that it has a bit of a tradition, a history of both solidarity economy work and other social movement work. And so there is a pretty robust ecosystem of organizations, of technical support. It's a center of capital, so it's both the highly contested region, but there's a lot of resources there. So the Bay Area is unique in that sense, but we partner with, let's see, on the worker co-op side, there is something called the Network of Bay Area Worker Cooperative. So it is sort of a mutual aid group of worker cooperatives. And so we end up working with them to advance policy because it's directly affecting their members, for example. So sort of member-driven, people-driven policy change that we can kind of help with some of the more technical sides of that. Increasingly, I think this is something we've invested in building relationships in over the past few years in particular, is really working with more frontline organizers and groups that are not necessarily focused on the solidarity economy per se, but whose interests are aligned. So working more closely with tenant unions and other sort of housing justice groups who become more interested in not just resisting evictions, but in like owning the land themselves. And so we're able to partner with them in developing community land trusts or pushing for visionary policy change at the state level. I can say in my experience in organizing just in the last few years in South Carolina, where there isn't that same ecosystem of organizations, it's kind of like building with whoever's willing. You got to start someplace. And I'll say I'm not doing a whole lot of solidarity economy work in Charleston right now because there's actually just other harm reduction work that really needs to happen first. Like we have a massive eviction crisis here. It's one of the highest eviction rates in the country, and there's just no tenant-led organizations even pushing back on that. And so that's where I've ended up focusing a lot of my time is just in building tenant leadership and other grassroots community institutions, because that's what's needed. But I think over time can be a home for building out some of these other more visionary tactics.
Hey, Chris, we've met briefly before.
Yeah, Legal Cafe or a workshop.
It was like a follow-up to Legal Cafe, I think like a year ago or something. So I'm a family physician. I have a clinic in Richmond. Right now it's just me, but my plan is to expand and to form a worker cooperative in the future. And there is a worker cooperative law in Virginia that's kind of specifically lists a few categories, and healthcare is not explicitly listed, but then it also says you can generally form a worker cooperative of any like community-based entity. There's a specific language in the law about it's more general than that. So I'm talking to a lawyer who's not familiar with that law as much and trying to see what is legally allowed. One barrier I'm coming into in Virginia law is that a healthcare clinic, a private healthcare clinic, can't be owned by non-licensed individuals, which is true in some states. Not true in like New York, for example. I don't know about California or where you are in South Carolina. So that's just like a barrier that I've faced that potentially could, if we do form a private worker cooperative, it would be essentially maybe only owned by, or at least a majority owned by the licensed practitioners in the clinic. And then there could be a separate category of workers who are maybe employed only, or maybe have a minority ownership in the practice. That I'm trying to distinguish that right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are, you can only speak to California laws, but probably similar principles. Often professional classes that are regulated separately. So for example, lawyers also can't form cooperative businesses with non-lawyers for similar reasons. The idea being that you don't want a lawyer being directed by a non-lawyer. I don't know, it's kind of bullshit, but that's the issue. And so in some cases, we are ourselves democratically managed, but we're a nonprofit, so there's no owners per se.
Right.
That's sort of our way around it, but it doesn't allow us to, allocate patronage in the same ways. Although there's flexibility with, creative compensation policies, I think, that can sometimes try to mimic worker cooperative dividends, but you have to be careful about that sometimes as well. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the law does force us into compromises sometimes. The question is often like, who's willing to take a risk to sort of push those boundaries, and who can afford to take risks in service of changing some of those laws. Yeah.
And forming a worker cooperative of like physicians and nurse practitioners doesn't change the power structure that much, though. Like having a democratic clinic would. And if we had to, like having the workers form a union, if we have to do that, and like be supportive of that, would be one way if they can't be owners. Or really expanding the idea of what a licensed practitioner is. So thinking about like a licensed practical nurse. I'm trying to see if that would work. Or if you had like a licensure as like a medical assistant or something like that, because there are some licensing bodies for them. So really seeing how that could work.
That seems like a creative way forward.
Yeah. Thanks for your talk. This is great. Sorry I was late.
No worries. Good to see you again.
So Chris, I was just curious, is your movement to South Carolina a movement for the legal center to kind of expand its where it's working, or I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it was a personal decision, not on the behalf of the organization, but it certainly prompts questions for us internally, which we've had a recurring basis of how much do we really center on Oakland or California versus beginning to really allocate some of our time and resources elsewhere. I think for a long time, our vision was that we would help create other community-based law centers that kind of have a similar purpose. And that's one of the goals of the fellowship, in a sense, is to support solidarity economy attorneys and other places to start their own projects, whether it's, a for-profit solo practice or a nonprofit. So we're seeing more of them kind of pop up. Because state laws are so specific and the licensing requirements around lawyers is so tied to state, it's harder for us as a bunch of people licensed in California to like really get deeply involved in other places. But we're very much, I think, at this point committed to like building relationships with people around the country and recognizing that it's only powerful to like change laws locally if we're connected translocally, you know, so that we can turn individual acts into collective acts, I guess.
I have another question. You mentioned about one of the things that you're focused on is trying to help the boomers who are business owners, like supporting them if they want to in converting their businesses to worker co-ops. So, and I think there's a movement like the 50 by 50 that's by the Democracy Cooperative. So are there resources for people who would like to like locally reach out to like local business owners if you find out that you know that there's a business owner who's at that stage? Like that's something that people who want the solidarity economy can actually do in their own communities. Is there anything like that to support, like how do you talk to those business owners and things like that?
Yeah, good question. So one of our other close partners, particularly on this cooperative conversion work, is called Project Equity. And they work mostly with the current owners on sort of owner-led conversions and have a lot of resources, I think, to sort of help make the case for that. Drop a link to their website to help owners kind of think through that. I don't totally know if they were, I guess they do work across the country. You know, we work with them a lot in California stuff. So they're a great resource. We collaborate with them, but we tend to be more kind of worker centric, whereas they're owner focused. But I think having both of those pieces in the ecosystem, you know, can be important for sure. There's another group more regionally in the South called Industrial Commons. And I haven't worked with them as closely, so I don't know totally all of their work, but they're focused on, I think, like worker buyouts of factories and manufacturing, even small scale productive work, and they're based in North Carolina, but so it may have more kind of Southern ties.
Okay, thanks.
I think that acquire, convert, support strategy is also what Evergreen does in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio. And they're also focused on sort of the industrial sector. They recently launched a private equity fund to support that work. It's sort of like Main Street Phoenix, but for like small scale industrial companies, and it's actually operating. So yeah, I mean, I really appreciate and like am excited about like bringing forward more opportunities for worker initiated conversions, because it's just so much harder. And you know, my focus is on news organizations, and that's almost always a hostile worker owner relationship.
Yeah, Olivia is definitely a great resource with a lot of this stuff too. It's been great, even though I haven't gotten a chance to work with you super closely this year, but I know that you're doing good work.
And Jennifer, I also know that like some cities often have those like municipal programs where you can send people who have questions about conversions. Like New York during COVID launched its like a hotline that you call. And it's like, I'm curious about this thing about becoming a worker co-op. So you can call them up, and you know, I know the city of Santa Clara has stuff like that. So like sort of like what is like the city's version of like a public chamber of commerce where you can come to and ask questions about that. That could also be a strategy, is kind of supporting that knowledge within cities, if that's something that they want, where you could send people as a resource.
Chris, I wanted to ask a question. It's something that has been popping up with a few different people and spurred by Anthony was on earlier, but really thinking about capital, right? Like every time I hear a conversation, it's like we're idea rich, capital poor. So a lot of conversations on it now I'm hearing, looking at like just capital, building capital funds. You mentioned it a little bit. This has come through the Mapping Our Futures process. We know some people now in East Tennessee, and they were talking about this, and we're looking a little bit at the Ojima project in Boston's capital fund, just as a way to. I mean, maybe we need to start small, right? Maybe we just need to do like kind of like a what's it called, a ROSCA, like a community investment process, just to like practice that on a small scale, but then thinking about how you scale that up to actually start to build the resources that you need to either leverage other resources or to I mean, I know the mutual aid group in Charlottesville started a free store that they're trying to move forward, and like thinking about like, what's the long-term reality of that, and really thinking like if there was one thing we can do, like the capital is the thing we can start to build. So
yeah, I mean, obviously as a broader movement and even regionally, being able to control and govern capital is a pretty important strategic need. That said, though, I think there's there have to be projects that are ready to receive capital, and that's a lot of work in and of itself. So there's sort of a both and, or a chicken and the egg thing often with access to capital, because actually there is massive amounts of capital out there. It's very hard for us to access it as really small projects or isolated groups, which is why I think projects like the Seed Commons and others that are trying to aggregate kind of smaller, locally rooted projects so that we can sort of make bigger demands on capital is really powerful, because the divestment movement, for example, has had massive success. But the reality is that there's almost no place for that institutional capital to go. Like I was part of a group, I went to Standing Rock, some years ago now, and then we went back to Oakland and we organized, and we briefly got the city of Oakland to divest from its relationship with JP Morgan Chase. Like they made the decision in the city council meeting, and then like instantaneously the lawyer was like, there's actually no place where we're legally allowed to put our money that's not invested in fossil fuels, because there's all these requirements around insurance, deposits, and where public monies can be held. And there just literally wasn't a community bank or a credit union that met all those requirements. That actually led to a successful public banking campaign that we just won. We had the Public Banking Act passed, which now creates the enabling environment to create public banks. It didn't actually create them yet. But that's, I think, to me, one of the examples of like forcing the crisis of jurisdiction, in the sense where we like force them to acknowledge that, yes, our relationship with this extractive company is harming our people, but there's no alternatives yet, and we need to build them. That's a little bit beyond your question, but one thing that I'm involved in locally, which I mentioned, is a mutual aid fund. It's called the Low Country Mutual Aid Fund, and we've been raising money from folks. Like we did a Share Your Check campaign, during the first bailout, and then I've been redistributing it democratically to people and organizations who've been sort of systematically excluded from resources. And my kind of long-term vision, I don't know if it will come to fruition, is like that could turn into a revolving loan fund for solidarity economy projects, but we're starting as like we're just trying to meet basic needs right now. So I think there are creative ways that are about organizing capital and then building the governing capacity for then when you actually have projects that really need it, then you can scale that up.
Yeah, I would say if there's one thing that, I mean, talking to a few mutual aid people, I mean, the crisis has kind of shown that you can, I mean, they've quickly created kind of alternative, like, I mean, they're replicating charitable systems still, but there's ways to kind of work outside some of these systems, some of the, like the community foundations and those types of systems, which kind of replicate that hierarchy, and are pretty risk averse to doing anything other than kind of really very traditional kind of work, or just kind of reinforcing the status quo. So I think there's this kind of energy, I think that has produced, which I think that's part of, I mean, the fact that people are like, oh, we can raise $50,000, and we did it, like COVID, which is a moment, but the sustainability of that and thinking about it. So I appreciate like that, thinking about what's the broader infrastructure that needs to get created around those things. So yeah, not really a question, more just a follow-up statement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I probably do need to hop off shortly. It's been good sharing, talking with y'all.
Yeah, really appreciate it. I think, I mean, I think one thing we could do is maybe go, like Joe and I are talking, but I think there's others that could, maybe we can find some law students to get to get into that fellowship program as a way of starting to do some of this stuff. Again, I think legal aid has a breadth of, and we've got UVA Law School, which is tends to be pretty neoliberal. Well, no, it is pretty neoliberal law school, but maybe there's a few people in there we could find, or something similar in Richmond as a way of kind of seeding some stuff.
Yeah, actually, I can't believe I didn't remember this before, but one of my dearest friends and comrades is a solidarity economy attorney. He's based in Maryland, but their practice may have Virginia licensed attorneys. They're more in the DMV region, but it's called Gilmore Kandar. It's their, let me look it up. Website. But yeah, they're one of the few other explicitly solidarity economy legal outfits, and they're based in the region. They're doing great work. It looks like their website's not a thing, but you can pull it up. It just says coming soon. But Parag, who's my friend, he works at the GW School of Law, I believe, and they have a really rad transactional law clinic. So again, that's in DC, but there is some good work happening in that region. He would probably know folks in Virginia.
I mean, Northern Virginia has got a little bit of, it's got some momentum happening in terms of cooperative development and whatnot. So I can see that. I mean, I can see, it's like, again, like hearing you talk about Oakland and San Francisco, right? Like there's a momentum because there's a culture there. I mean, it's like we look at efforts that are going on in Massachusetts or the Midwest or whatnot, and Virginia just doesn't have that history or the infrastructure, purposely doesn't have that.
Right.
So it's like we're creating something from scratch. But
yeah, and I've been talking to David on and off for a few years now about, like, David from Highlander Center, about how do we build the technical assistance landscape in the South for this kind of work. And yeah, I need to circle back with him about some of that, just because the last year got weird. But it's great that y'all are connected already, and I think that could be a cool potential follow-up step, down the line at some point.
Yeah, great. Anybody else have any last questions before we let Chris go? No. A great job dealing with little one coming. I love it when little ones come into to meetings. Best.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time on Zoom, unfortunately, because he just wants to come hang out. So I'm used to it now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. This is great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Good to be with you. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Great.
It's good to see you.
Thanks all. We'll see everybody soon.
Peace.
Bye.
Cheers.